Hi, I'm Dr. Rob Wildman, and this video is all about protein, my favorite nutrient. Super excited to do it. We're going to cover a lot of ground, including different types of protein, protein in the human body, what happens in muscle when we eat protein, what happens when we train and we eat protein, how much protein do we need, protein's thermogenic effect, the application of protein to different types of sports. Sit back, we're going to have a lot of fun. Here we go. Just about 10 years ago, I stated that the 2010s would be the decade of protein. As we move into the 2020s, this is going to be the second decade of protein. This is an exciting time because we're really learning more and more about the applications of protein to the human body. The human body, all of its structure and functional operations. But for our purposes, we want to know more about how the protein that we eat translates into muscle and performance aspects for athletes and people just looking to improve the way that their body performs and the way that their body looks. When considering protein as dietary macro, we see that primarily dietary protein is dedicated to nourishing the structural and functional basis of the human body, with very little that would be dedicated towards fuel intentionally. Meanwhile, carbohydrate and fat, primarily as a macro, they're delivering fuel to the human body. They have a little bit of a regulatory and structural role, but in general, carbohydrates and fats are fuel, separating macros into two broad categories: protein, structural, functional, and then carbohydrate and fat, which is more fuel with much less structural and functional. So if we look at body macros, we see that carbohydrate makes up a very small percentage of our body weight, typically less than 1%. Protein in the mid-teens, maybe higher for athletes, and then body fat actually has the greatest range of adaptability of any macronutrient when it comes to body composition. Then when you shift over to their percentage intended use as fuel, you see that by and large carbohydrate and fat primarily are intended as fuel, as we said earlier. Protein can be used as fuel, but in general it's too valuable and it's intended more for structural and functional roles. And going a little bit deeper as to where protein is in the human body and using some really basic standards, such as a typical lean man may be about 16% protein by weight. About 45% of his body mass is muscle, and if you assume about 22% of muscle is actually protein, you do some calculations and you figure that about 18 pounds of protein is in muscle and about 30 pounds of total body protein is available as well. So when you do 18 divided by 30, about 60 to 65% of body protein is within the skeletal muscle. So then when we look more closely at muscle protein itself, we see that it's very dynamic. Two counterbalancing processes, somewhat distinct but yet related in stimuli: muscle protein synthesis, or the building of muscle protein, and muscle protein breakdown, which is the breakdown of muscle protein. The sum of the two really determines directionality over time. If muscle protein synthesis is greater than breakdown, then you can predict a potential directional positive change over time. So algebraically, we look at muscle protein synthesis minus muscle protein breakdown as a directional predictor for adaptation and whether or not somebody is moving towards their goals. When it comes to building muscle mass and strength, we need to tip the balance of muscle protein synthesis so that it's greater than breakdown over the course of a day, week, month, what have you. Directionally, then, that presents the best opportunity for adaptation. The way that we get there is with training and a higher protein intake. Now let's go into a little bit more detail about training and the influence on the balance between muscle protein synthesis and breakdown. If a person trains on an empty stomach, meaning they haven't eaten for several hours, they haven't had protein digestion and absorption of amino acids for an extended period of time, the training can increase muscle protein synthesis while at the same time increased muscle protein breakdown. That's because the muscle doesn't have a big supply of amino acids coming in from the diet, so it has to draw upon the sources of protein that are already in there. It has to digest, break down its own protein in order to provide the amino acid building blocks. This all changes as soon as somebody eats protein. Muscle protein synthesis is increased even higher after training when protein is involved. Furthermore, muscle protein breakdown is reduced significantly as the muscle no longer has to rely on its own protein and protein from elsewhere in the body because amino acids are coming in from the diet. So we know the impact of a resistance training session will increase muscle protein synthesis, but how long does it last? And what's the impact on metabolism? Well, we can actually measure metabolism the day after and even 2 days after a very strenuous resistance training session, and we still see an elevation in metabolism. That elevation in metabolism reflects muscle protein synthesis. It costs a lot of energy to build protein in the human body. Every time you link together 2 amino acids, it is the equivalent of 4 ATPs to get to that point. As it became clear that muscle protein synthesis endured for 1 to 2 days after a resistance training session, it really reinforces the idea that you should nourish the recovery process during that time as well, and that throughout the day, meals and pacing of protein became increasingly popular as a concept. So every time you eat a protein-rich meal, the protein is digested to amino acids. The amino acid levels in the blood increase, exceeding critical thresholds. That tells us that there are amino acids entering into the muscle and becoming available for muscle protein synthesis, the building of new muscle protein. How much is necessary at a meal? We're going to talk about next. So classic studies with measuring muscle protein synthesis in response to exercise and varied protein levels suggested that there was sort of this lower threshold that needed to be achieved with an acute intake of protein in order to increase muscle protein synthesis measures above a level of statistical significance, somewhere that lived around 20 grams to 25 grams for most individuals, particularly males, that were measured. But that lower threshold, say 20 to 25 grams or about 0.3 grams per kilogram body weight, doesn't necessarily indicate how much an upper limit might be for different individuals. So in a response to exercise, and when you come out of not eating protein for several hours, such as perhaps an overnight fast, getting more protein is important, especially when you're working out more muscle mass during that exercise session. More recent research is suggesting that 40 grams is better than 20 grams in that situation where you're doing more of a total body workout and you haven't eaten for several hours prior. And while we recognize that protein timing is certainly important, the total amount that you get over the course of the day is probably a much better predictor as to how we progress towards our goals. The International Society of Sport Nutrition recommends 1.4 to 2 grams per kilogram body weight per day as a good recommendation for athletes and people who are training hard to strive for. And the recommendations of the ISSN are aligned with the American College of Sports Medicine. In addition, the International Protein Board also makes similar recommendations for people who train hard and who are athletes, as well as general exercise and fitness. You can find a protein needs calculator on the International Protein Board's website. Often people ask how higher protein intake recommendations align against general recommendations for the public at large. And we often fall back on the RDA and the acceptable dietary macronutrient ranges. So when you align it that way, we actually find that the RDA is a very low recommendation for protein intake and is all the way at the lower end of the ADMR. So when you compare the recommendations of the IPB, the ISSN, or ACSM for higher protein intakes for people who train and athletes, we typically find that 2.5 times the RDA is what's being recommended. Now, what's important to realize is athletes and people who train harder have higher caloric requirements. So as calorie intake goes up, these still fit comfortably within the ADMR, or the acceptable dietary macronutrient range. So beyond building muscle and strength, or perhaps increasing endurance, there are other benefits associated with having more protein in your diet, making sure that you hit these recommendations. Here are a couple of them. Number one, protein does a better job than fat and carbohydrate in helping to control hunger. Number two, it's a more thermogenic macronutrient. A lot of this has to do with protein's ability to increase protein synthesis throughout the body. Carbohydrate and fat don't seem to have that ability. Protein provides the building blocks plus a direct stimulus that helps crank up protein manufacturing, not just in muscle, but elsewhere in the body as well. Lastly, it seems to do the best job in helping people shape a more fit body. When you substitute protein calories for either carbohydrate or fat calories, at the very least, it can have a positive impact on body composition over time, especially for those individuals who are exercising. Protein isn't just protein. One way that different types of proteins will vary is in their amino acid composition. Essential amino acids, branched chain amino acids, which are essential amino acids, and in particular leucine. Leucine is a branched chain amino acid, which is also an essential amino acid, which seems to be a signal for muscle and other tissue in the body to dial up protein manufacturing. Now, how quickly different proteins are digested and absorbed has a lot to do with what happens in the stomach. The stomach is a very acidic environment, and those proteins that remain more soluble in an acidic environment tend to move through the stomach more quickly. For instance, whey protein loves stomach acid. It stays highly dissolved and is able to move into the small intestine quickly. That allows for faster digestion of the protein and absorption of amino acids. In fact, whey protein is the fastest. On the other hand, casein protein doesn't do as well in the stomach. It tends to gel up, and it takes a longer time for it to move out of the stomach into the small intestine, slowing the rate of digestion and absorption of casein versus, say, whey. Most other proteins sort of fall in the middle of those two bookend proteins. When looking at the potency of different types of protein, we tend to find that whey protein, at least within the first hour or so, has the highest influx of amino acids, plus has the greatest impact on muscle protein manufacturing. Some of that is because of the higher leucine content, and the other part of it is because whey protein is being digested and the amino acids are being absorbed at a faster rate. So while whey protein is viewed by many to be the most potent of the proteins, there's certainly no shortage of different protein options today to help people achieve their higher protein recommendations. So we're going to wrap it up right there for this video, and certainly there's the opportunity for additional videos within the series on protein-related matters. I'm Dr. Rob Wildman. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can reach out to me at the email address that's here, drrobwildman@outlook.com. Or you can get in touch with me through Instagram or Twitter at TheNutritionDoc.